All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started, Audrey, if that sounds good to you.
Yeah, perfect.
Awesome. All right. Hello, good morning, everybody. My name is Greg. I am a principal here at Collectiv. Thanks again for everybody joining the Collectiv Academy today, in which we'll be reviewing inventory planning with Power BI. If this is your first time attending a Collectiv Academy training, welcome. We have these every Thursday morning at 9 a.m. Central Time. If you are returning, thanks again for showing up today. Excited to deliver to you this inventory planning with Power BI. One of the Collectiv consultants, Ruben Copa, will be presenting this. I'll do a quick introduction to him here in a minute. Before we actually get to that, just a quick overview of who Collectiv is and what we're all about. So we are a data analytics and strategy consulting firm based out of Chicago, Illinois. However, we are 100% virtual, and we have consultants located all across the US and some in Canada as well. We specialize specifically within the Microsoft stack, and we have a strong focus in the Power Platform, which is Power BI, Power Apps, and Power Automate, as well as the surrounding Azure services that usually accompany those tools. So anything that stores your data in Azure, anything that moves your data or transforms your data. So tools like Azure SQL Database, Azure Data Lakes, Azure Synapse, Data Factory, Databricks, all these different tools we specialize in and help organizations when deploying out, different business intelligence, AI, and ML implementations throughout the organization. So we help organizations all the way from strategy to implementation to support. So strategy meaning if you're needing some advice on how to roll out business intelligence throughout your organization, if you're not really sure how to get started, data governance, architecture, infrastructure, and then taking that strategy and actually moving that to an implementation project and actually producing Power BI reporting, data warehousing, and things like that. That said, that is a brief synopsis of Collectiv. So if there's anything that we can help you with, please let us know. But with that being said, what I'd like to do now is hand it over to Ruben, who is going to be taking us through inventory planning with Power BI. So a quick thing on inventory planning. So for some of you on the call, you may be very well of Power BI and that you can actually report against inventory, but there are tools available out there that actually integrate into the Power BI platform that allow you to actually perform right back and enable you to actually plan from within the tool itself. So without further ado, Ruben, I'm going to hand it over to you and you can show everyone on the call how this is done.
Sweet. Thanks, Greg. Just make sure the light's muted. Right, as Greg, a bit of an echo there. Maybe you could mute Greg. That's better. Sweet, thank you. Going to be taking you through inventory planning using Power BI with a few transitions. So I've been working with Collectiv for a few years now. I've actually been working with the Collectiv team for 18 years. We've got a lot of experience in the planning, financial planning arena. We've kind of crossed paths over that time as technology's changed, as we've come back and developed and worked with different solutions. And as I'll take you through, the last few years have been particularly exciting with regards to Power BI specifically and the rest of the Microsoft framework in terms of being able to get up and running and trial and play around with and then implement full-featured planning solutions with very cost-effective software that is very mature despite its youth and also evolving very quickly. I'm a Microsoft certified engineer across data warehouse and data models. I will touch on those topics today. Very light touch. They do form a lot of the technology that goes behind what you'll be doing from a power user perspective, but it won't be an in-depth look at all. And I have been working with Power BI for about half of its life. It took me a few years to get involved. So today we're initially just going to touch on what we mean when we refer to planning and understanding what it is that you want to be able to plan and what that encompasses. the scope of that, as well as kind of what's involved. Of course, the focus is then on leveraging Power BI to be able to do that. Some of the very basic ways you can get up and running pretty quickly from a reporting standpoint, but then also from further analysis and, of course, the right back and planning aspect. While we won't look at OLAP and data warehouse technology in detail, we will spend a little bit of time looking at dimensions. These are a key aspect of the way that you plan. They're not particularly complex, but if there are new concepts, there is a little bit of vernacular to get your head around as you're producing the models that you're going to want to use for future planning. We'll then use that context and that knowledge to define your inventory planning model, or at least an example. I think we've got a fairly intimate group today, so if we can get some feedback and audience participation, it makes this much more relevant, and everyone typically walks away with a little bit of extra added value. I've got a basic architecture here for what we're going to discuss, but it is based on what I'm assuming of people's knowledge and a bit of experience running these things. So any questions that you'd like to bring up, either shout them out or otherwise just put in the chat. If you don't want to do that, I'll try and keep my eyes on it, or if one of the team, Audrey or Greg, can shout out and let me know as questions come through. Then we can respond to them, and the agenda might take a little bit of different flow, but it'll probably be more useful to at least one or more people in the audience. So please keep that in mind. As we get towards the end and time allowing, we'll kind of go through exactly what those steps would be in a little bit of detail. So how to get from an existing Excel sheet that you're using for planning to a model within Power BI with the appropriate dimensionality that you're actually able to write back to and then use across the Power BI framework, and do some basic planning with that model. So, as I said, starting with understanding the planning aspect. Planning means a bunch of different things to different people. Tends to mean Excel a lot of the times. Sometimes it's bringing information in from either your general ledger, or typically with inventory planning, it might be an ERP or a specific kind of software framework that you've got some way of extracting data from. That's typically a bunch of different ways people do it. With Excel, it's probably bottom up or some method of using formulas to try and allocate and get a top down, or otherwise it's top level, but without necessarily that extra level of detail that flows down throughout the model that you'll be able to get by using an OLAP style of budgeting, and every other kind of combination and iteration of them, which we kind of call middle out. Throughout this process, we've got multiple stakeholders and roles. That's an important aspect as well. So is everyone making changes? Are people making changes to just particular products or to just particular regions, or any other dimensions that you may have? Does everyone have full access to read it? Can people make changes such as adding new products? All things to kind of think about and understand as we architect a solution. Typically when you start, it's just going to be a one user solution with full admin rights, and you can operate throughout the model, make any changes to dimensions, to plans that you have, duplicate those plans, change those plans in their entirety. As you kind of build it out, you'll start to put in place some processes and roles around them to prevent, in some cases, anyone from making changes to, say, scenarios that have already been closed or locked off particular plans. Or as I said before, if you've got particular regions or a breakdown in the way that your company operates and separate responsibility for areas of those plans, then you might create those kind of structures as well. And that's a relatively straightforward process once you've worked out how you want those rules to be applied. For planning, particularly inventory planning, obviously non-financial data sources, a couple of the models we're going to look at today are based in warehousing as well as retail sales planning. And obviously in the warehousing and the manufacturing side of things, there's a bunch of non-financial data that's used to produce those budgets, and you may integrate that model into the system, or you may keep your existing non-financial data outside and just import the outputs of those systems into the model that you produce. So we'll take a quick look at that as well. I just touched on kind of version control. That's pretty linked in to stakeholders and roles. It doesn't have to be. It can just be done, again, in a one-user system in terms of locking plans once they've been completed, copying those plans across or duplicating them, changing the permissions for those plans, and then things as well like integrating your actuals and your forecasts for rolling forecasts throughout the course of the year or your planning periods, whatever that may be. And the security pretty much ties back to stakeholders and roles. There's obviously some technical aspects to that we won't really touch on too much today. So from a Power BI standpoint, and I didn't see the surveys today, but I'll assume that there is a moderate to high level of understanding of Power BI. But just quickly for those that are kind of less experienced, it's kind of been around for 5 or 6 years. And it's an incredibly powerful visualization tool. They have 1 month development cycles, and they're always rolling out new features. It can be a little bit of a hindrance sometimes, but it's by and large pretty impressive in terms of the way they respond to consumer and community feedback and voting and discussion of new features to be able to roll out new features on a pretty impressive basis. It's very powerful and performant. It's primarily a desktop application. Once you have the desktop application, you can publish to the Power BI service. You'll have a tenant available or a shared tenant available to yourself, so you have an allocation of kind of computing power and resource time, which makes it much faster to be able to review the models that you've built and for users to interact just through their browser and also through a mobile application. So you can, from the Power BI desktop app, build out these reports by bringing in simple integrations with a whole bunch of your data sources. Those of you who have used Power Query in Excel, it's kind of like that taken to the next level. You can effectively pull in data sources, whether they're SQL Server, Oracle, Excel files, PDF, SharePoint, CSV. There's a whole bunch of different data integrations that you can effectively pull into the one model. And then you can basically build relationships effectively between these models to be able to drag and drop and do some pretty powerful reporting kind of out of the box. From there, just kind of the next level of working with its programming interface using a combination of DAX, which is basically a programming-ish language that evolved from MDX, which used to be used for analysis services, but it's a different kind of language if you're not familiar with it, but again, extremely powerful and be able to define what we call measures, which we can basically use a pretty complex language to be able to integrate with, doing comparisons, and basically any kind of data processing that you can think of. It is something you need to develop a skill set for, and typically something you'd have resources for maybe in-house or that you could reach out to. But it does then take that sort of pretty simple drag and drop tool to the next level where there's very little that you can't do. It also has integrations with tools such as Python, which then just gives you the next level of kind of programmability and removal of bounds. It's very low cost for end users, and then as a platform as well, whether you're just using the Power BI service or whether you're using the Power BI service to have a more dedicated instance. I'm not too familiar with all the pricing, but there's guys here that can help you with that, and it's pretty readily publicly available as well. As I said, it's multi-platform, so browser and mobile development. Iterations are very quick, very responsive, and it does leverage the Microsoft framework across the board. So you've got integration with things like Power Apps, which gives you more programmability, Microsoft Flow, of course, the whole Azure kind of suite. So it is very nicely packaged up, should you want to use it in that manner. But again, you can just download the app and use it, connect to whatever data sources you want yourself, and you're not constrained or tied into that Microsoft platform or ecosystem. Very simple integrations that I touched on, and pretty powerful models of protection and governance. I think a couple of these other Collectiv Academies focus much more on that governance aspects, so you can check them out historically. Maybe someone can post some links to them, or we have them on an ongoing basis. So I'm not sure when they're next slated for, but worth checking out if that's of interest to you. So to be able to budget in Power BI, what do we require? So we need the infrastructure, we need to store the values somewhere. So when you get Power BI, you get the reporting tool. You don't get a database with it. You can hook it up, obviously, to the different sources I've said before, but you need somewhere to store your values. So this infrastructure, initially, it could be a CSV. It could also be a SQL database. It could be any of the kind of database we've spoken about. But once you've decided you want to plan outside of kind of the Excel framework or your existing framework, you are going to need somewhere to store those values. You're going to want interoperability. So you'll want to connect it to your existing systems, most likely, to be able to pull out some of the elements that are associated with your actuals. So maybe your products, your inventory, obviously, is a subset of that or superset of that. Your customers, maybe your regions. So you're going to want to be able to pull things from your existing system into your budgeting system to be able to create that framework, and then obviously to be able to do the kind of variance analysis going forward. Ideally, you want flexibility and accessibility, so a way to define and edit dimensions and the structure. And we'll touch on that a bit further once we explain clearly and by way of example what dimensions are. Security we've touched on already, and concurrency. So again, not wanting to use typically a single CSV or something. You want a system that's capable of handling multiple users transacting with, so reading and or writing to the database at the same point in time. Just quickly, OLAP is basically a way of structuring and analyzing data. It's typically compared to or defined by a cube structure. If you think about an Excel sheet as having two dimensions, so your X and your Y axis, your rows and your columns. If you add additional sheets to the workbook, you've then kind of got a third dimension, which could kind of be a cube. So you might have your cities and your time on each sheet, and you might have a product, a sheet for each product. That's 3 dimensions. If you can think about it, you probably have 4 or 5 or 6 dimensions. It becomes difficult for us to visualize that in an image, which is why a cube is typically used. But effectively, it's just a collection of dimensions. And that's useful because each dimension can have properties for consolidation. So rolling up, you might have product groupings, for example. In regions, you might have cities and then countries. In time, you might have months as the lowest level, and then roll up into quarters and years, for example. Conversely, drill down is basically the opposite of that. So if you're starting at a product group level and you want to drill down to an individual SKU, for example, that's an example of drill down. And again, you're using the dimension for that. So you're using the product dimension. And slicing and dicing just refers to being able to move about in a combination of dimensions across axes and filters to slice and dice and come up with kind of the view that assists you in either the analysis or the method in which you're planning. So dimensions I've kind of touched on a few times now, and just to be clear, they're basically a way of categorizing facts and measures as a technical term. A fact is just when something happens. So for just example, an order being processed, and that would correspond to a line or a row being created in your system, either general ledger or your sales system or whatnot. And that is a fact. And that fact has some details attached to it. And that's effectively what forms dimensions. In the row in your system, you might have 30 or 40 columns, some of which are measures. So it might be the quantity, the price, it could be other details associated with that order. And then the rest are dimensions. So there are things associated with that order that are used to categorize it that aren't related directly to it as a measure. But putting aside the difference between a fact and a measure, it's just ways of being able to break down and then slice or dice. So typically, and I've touched on these, you'll have geography, you've always got a time, you've typically got a scenario, which is actual budget forecast. That's important as an additional slicer or way of analyzing your data when you want to do further variance analysis. So it's a geography, products, sometimes customers, sometimes for sales, you might have sales rep. That rep might form within geography, for example, but maybe it doesn't. Maybe you have reps across multiple geographies. So it's not always straightforward to work out whether things are separate dimensions, whether there's relationships between them, whether there's a hierarchy. The example of sales reps is a good one. For product, it's normally pretty straightforward. A product doesn't normally belong to multiple categories, but it might. So there is a little bit of work when you sort of create these going forward in terms of optimizing them and working out what falls within one dimension, what forms within multiple dimensions, and typically comes down to the relationship between the two of them. If it's one to many, if it's many to one, and kind of that sort of stuff. They're also then typically used for security access. So you'll tie your security to a dimension, whether it's locking down a scenario or locking down a time period or giving people access to a particular region or product. And they're comprised of an index and attribute. So what's important about an index, this is a key concept, is that when you're creating a dimension, there needs to be a unique index in which you refer to the lowest level of detail. So in products, this might be a SKU. In geography, it could be a city. It might actually be an office location. So it's the lowest level and it needs to be unique. So you can't refer to it multiple times in the dimension. Otherwise, when you're trying to review the data, it won't be clear which dimension index it belongs to. For time, it's usually just the year and the month. If it's months, if you've got days, it's down to days. But you do need to have an index, and that's typically, or that's always then how you assign data, so say facts and measures, to that dimension. So hopefully there's enough there to get your head around a dimension. So once you kind of understand the basic technical components of your planning solution, you need to work out how it is that you want to plan, or how you define your model, in other words. And typically the best way of doing this, or the best way of starting to do this, is to look at what you do at the moment. And often we hear that, you know, what we do now isn't what we want to do. We want best practice, but it's important to understand the way it's carried out at the moment from a bird's eye view as well, not just the the perspective of the person who is necessarily carrying out the bulk of it at the moment, largely for technical reasons, but to understand from a more broad perspective, how is this planning process carried out? And for inventory planning and whatnot, that comes down to perhaps input sheets and reports. Maybe you're getting them from a sales rep, maybe you're getting them from a warehouse or a warehouse manager. Maybe at the moment you've got a bunch of instructional documentation that goes out. Maybe emails are sent out in a certain period to those that are involved in the budgeting process, informing them of the timeline that's coming up, providing them with some sort of input sheets and or reports from existing systems to compare them to, and maybe raw data dumps are kind of part of that as well, that come from either previous budgeting systems or budgets and or the actual system. So understanding what that currently looks like is an important step. And then once you've kind of collated that information, it's important to look at the way the budget and the data is broken down. And this very much comes back to the design of dimensions. And within those dimensions, the hierarchies I spoke about, so roll-ups and groupings, relationships, which we touched on as well. And then attributes are basically bits of information related to an item in a dimension. So for a SKU, it might be color or size or weight. For an office, it could be its location, latitude and longitude, or any other kind of attributes that are useful in the budgeting. For employees, it could be a bunch of their remuneration and commission related structure that might be important as part of the process as well. And always remember, you've got to have, or you should always have scenario. So again, at most basic actual budget, but realistically, forecast 1, forecast 2, an internal forecast. We normally get people's names as a forecast, which you should try and avoid, but scenario is important in that perspective, and you obviously have to have period, some way of breaking down your time. And again, that's typically just a year and a month. Depending on the way you budget, that can be down to the day, but typically planning, we see at a monthly level. Obviously then when comparing to the actuals, sometimes there's daily detail through there, but not used so much in the variance analysis in most of the solutions that we've kind of seen. And measures is just, again, the numerical bits of data that are important. So say in inventory planning, if it's coming from a sales perspective, it could be price and quantity. or if it's coming from manufacturing, it could be, again, the costs, the cost of the materials, the cost of production, that kind of stuff. So you need to have a measures dimension to be able to refer to each of those measures within the cubes. So that's kind of the basic concepts in about 20-25 minutes. Are there any initial questions around this before we kind of start to go through one of the ways that you could carry this out? And before I do that, I'll take you through a bunch of the output reports so you can kind of see where you could be aiming to get to.
Nothing yet, but kind of to Ruben's point made earlier, everybody, if you have any questions, if something's not clear or you're just curious, feel free to, just post something in the chat, and we're happy to kind of pause things and step you through it.
Thanks, Greg. So there's a question here on whether to use Power Query, and the language it uses is called M. It's got a fairly visual interface within Power Query, which you can use to try and interface, but it does also then have, at any point in time, you can view in the advanced editor the actual code behind it, which, if that's your thing, is a bit more flexible, and you can kind of roll out a little bit more rapidly, or to whether to use DAX, which is then, so Power Query and M is basically used when you interface with the data on the way in, and then DAX is used once you have the data in the model to be able to make changes and work with that within Power BI. I'm not an expert at these things. I think it depends, again, largely on whether you want to interface with the data when it's coming in from that source, or whether you're sort of interacting with multiple data sources. Greg, I don't know if you want to expand on this. This question.
Yeah, I think the answer is it depends. So basically, it depends upon the complexity of the calculation, and it depends upon what you're trying to solve with your metric. So if it depends upon how your data model is structured. So assuming your data model is structured in the best way possible, then I would assume DAX would be the best approach to take. It just really, I guess the answer is it really depends. If you're going to be, Power Query is more used, in my mind, to transform your data. So if you're transforming your data to, if your data tables are coming in, really dirty, they need cleaned up, you need to pivot tables, you need to remove columns, you need to maybe merge things together. That's where I see Power Query being very valuable. And then for the actual creating measures, so like if we're looking at total revenue, if we're looking at revenue last year, all of those things that can be done in these in DAX equations, to where that stuff's ran in memory and not taking up additional records inside your data set. So I'm not sure if that's clear or not. If you could provide more context, or it doesn't answer your question, Myra, just let us know and we'll try to go into more depth. So back to you, Ruben.
Thanks. So I'm just going to take you through now a couple of models in Power BI connected to retail sales systems, to manufacturing systems, and to financial systems, and just what those reports can look like, and how you can interact with them to write back, for example. So retail sales is kind of a nice, simple-ish example. Let's think about the dimensions we had. So we've got key account, which is basically like a customer dimension, and it's just flat here. We've got product line, and there's a couple of levels here. We've got accessories, equipment, footwear, outerwear, sportswear, kind of as at the top level. And then we've got men's, youth, and women and unisex. You can see here in this matrix a different way of looking at that. I basically sort of flipped it around. So you can look up men's first. You can look at, say, footwear, and then we can see, in this instance, there's one rep responsible for academy sport, in the 24 season in the forecast scenario for footwear, for men's footwear. This is Acteris matrix, so it looks kind of like a Power BI matrix. A few notable differences, the most important of which is you have an edit button. If I click this edit button, then I can interact with the matrix and change these values. So I might change from 3.6 to 4.6. It's red because I haven't saved it at the moment. I might want to make a bunch of different changes at different levels or throughout the matrix. Then I hit save. I hit refresh. And you can see that number that's been updated here. But then also anywhere that refers to it throughout the model is also updated. So you get that typical matrix functionality in terms of stacking dimensions across the axis, the ability to drill down across dimensions. So this is drilling down across two aspects of the product dimension, gender and line, and then the rep dimension. So you can see why, in a design perspective, maybe you'd put in gender as a dimension and line as a dimension. That wouldn't be a good idea for a bunch of reasons, but they're the kind of decisions you have to make when you're creating dimensions. I'll just touch on some of the other aspects of this report. So we've got some cards here providing nice high-level visuals. We've got some variance graphs comparing actual forecast to goal. And then what we have down here, this is a list of comments that have been created. So in Acteris as well, you can actually create comments for a particular intersection. So you can see here, if you want to make a comment for Rep 1, for accessories, for Academy, for the forecast, we can actually come up here and write a comment. You can make changes to it. You can use rich text. And this is not saved in the Power BI report. This is actually saved in the database and associated with this intersection. So it's accessible for people who want to interact with it. Acteris is just a SQL database, so again, within the Microsoft framework, but it's got a series of visuals which enable you to write back to that SQL database, either through visuals in Power BI, desktop or web service, and or there's an Excel tool as well. But all the data you're seeing here is just coming from a SQL server. It's just these matrices that are actually used to be able to write back and change that data. So just looking at a different kind of report, just in a different way of kind of slicing and dicing. So in this case, we're looking at Rep 51, and so this is for all the product lines. Let's just change it to, I think it was men's footwear we just did. Yeah, there we go. We changed it from 3.6 to 4.6. So this is a report that will basically show by rep for a particular sales item or product or intersection. So just a different way of slicing and dicing and being able to budget from it, again, top down, bottom up, or middle out approach. And those changes actually roll up as well as roll down. Part of the great benefit of using Power BI is that not only are you writing back the data, but you can immediately use existing reports to be able to compare and analyze that data. And variance analysis is one of the neatest ways of doing this. And I always like using waterfall charts when doing variance analysis, between two different scenarios. So here we're comparing goal to forecast, and we can see exactly what has been changed to be able to get from one scenario to the other, in this case by territory, and then in this case by key account. And because we've been splashing to this data on a tight level, the variance difference is not particularly interesting, but when you're using your real budget data, then obviously you have some more interesting kind of insights. Here's just another way of looking at the budget on a very top level. So if I, for example, just created a new forecast dimension, I'll show you later how you can just copy from one to the other. And say I'm doing some pretty high level planning, and I want to come in here, and I just want to say, look for all sales for a particular season, for a particular scenario, for all reps, for all products, for all key accounts. I want to come in here, and in S23, I can type in I 10%, and that'll increase by 10% proportionally everything across that budget version, and quite quickly. So this kind of stuff is super useful for your sort of C-level or high-level people sitting around and want to be able to see quite quickly, what if analysis. What if I change this or that, or remove this product, or get rid of this account, copy from here or there. As you can see, if data exists already, it's very quick to make those kind of changes and comparisons. And once you've got your reporting suite set up, you can do some pretty quick, high level, but also see the detail behind it, kind of prepare some nice visual comparisons as well. While we're in here, one other little tool that we have, we spoke about dimension creation before, is once you've created your dimensions, so here's the dimensions for this particular model. Say they've got their product line gender, so there's 17 of these guys. They've got the product line gender roll-up. They've got the product line, and they've got the gender roll-up. So this is just a concatenation of those two. Say, for example, we're planning out for a new season, or for a new year or season, and we want to actually introduce a new product line. You can actually do that from within here. So again, with the appropriate permissions, this is something you give to all of your users. But if I want to then create a new line called otherware, I don't need to create these, but you probably would for your business. We can then save that, and then
I think another good example of this, Ruben, is basically the scenario table, to where if you come in and you want to reforecast, or let's say you're reaching like your Q3 is coming up, or Q2 is coming to a close, it's really easy to just come in here and add that forecast. Let's say you're reforecasting that inventory for the rest of the year, and you can run that, add that in here, and then there's features in here. It's not a part of this demo, but then you can actually add mechanisms that copy over previous forecasts to the new forecast, and then to save time as far as getting the data in and out.
Yeah, spot on. So here I've just created a new one called the forecast run 2. I've used this name sort because it's probably used throughout the model to bring it up 2.5, but basically to update that, and then that's available across the entire model. So you just need to create it in that one spot, refresh depending on the data model. But you can see here now I've got a forecast run through. It's empty because we didn't copy the data across, but very quick to create these new dimension elements, which are then immediately usable across the rest of your model. Any questions on this this last little bit of demonstration?
Ruben, I know we could probably take everybody through some demos, and I definitely want you to kind of take through here. Any advice on, as far as like when you're going in here and you're setting this up and you're actually doing inventory planning in here, any thoughts around like key considerations, and if you're repeating it, it's perfectly fine. Key considerations when actually doing an inventory type planning inside of Power BI, like what would be the first things you'd want to consider?
It really comes down to that dimensionality, and so the way you're planning, and not just the dimensionality, but the measures which we touched on. So, when you plan, on what level are you planning, and on how are you going to want to be able to compare that later when you do variance analysis? So, is it by customer? Is it by product? Is it by region? Is it by more specific aspects of the products that you want to look at? Is it by the warehousing, the manufacturing plant that they come from? Is it from the wholesaler that they come from otherwise? So understanding not just how you're looking at planning, but how you're going to want to be able to compare that to actuals further down the line will help you in creating that structure. Again, once you've created dimensions, as I've shown you, it's pretty flexible to be able to add to them and to edit them. It's not quite as straightforward to add dimensions to a cube. You have to actually export the data, delete the cube, add the dimensions, ensure you've got the right data with for the new columns, because you'll have to extrapolate or interpret that somehow from wherever it's coming, and then recreating it. So it's not quite so straightforward. It's definitely doable, but if you can ensure that you've got the most level of detail that you'll need to have, it's much easier to use less detail later. The flip side of that is you don't want to have way too many dimensions, because it will start to impact performance. It's less of a problem than it used to be with the rate at which Moore's law is still kind of justifying the rate at which advancements to available resources locally and on the servers are. But you do want to make sure that you're capturing the lowest level of detail that you're going to want to use further down the line, and then just making sure you're capturing those drivers as well. So are you inputting just a dollar amount, or are you getting unit sales, price times quantity, or are you looking at the cost of materials plus the cost of production, and are they driven by other variables, right? So it's not just the granularity of the data from a dimensional perspective. It's also the input variables that you currently have and that you want to use to be able to produce that plan.
Sounds good. Yeah, I think a key point, on my side of things is one thing you mentioned is dimensionality and understanding how you're actually going to, what are the different ways you're going to have to write back or budget against. So that would be your, like Ruben was saying, is your dimensions. And the key aspect of this, everyone that's on the call, is the fact that this is all integrated into Power BI. So this is not, there's nothing mystical about this. It's basically you are creating a Power BI model. So like any other report, you would have dimensions and facts. We're doing the same thing when we're doing write back and we're doing planning with, whether that's inventory or financial planning. It's just now we have the ability to change that data from within the report itself. And you're actually writing back to your SQL database where that plan is stored. So, it's still creating your dimensions back to your fact tables. And in this instance, the fact table is actually the table that is holding our plan data. So like to Ruben's point, making sure you have those dimensions properly sought out so that you can basically plan to all those different intersections. Then I think there's a key aspect or a key element to make about the process that goes with your planning. So understanding what you currently have in place is very important, and understanding why it is in that method. So why you have that current process in place, because basically with this tool and with the way that, Power BI enables you to budget and plan and forecast now from within here, it basically gives you a blank sheet of how you want this to work. So you can really budget in any way you'd like to, and with this platform. So it allows you to really analyze your existing process and assess, hey, is this process the right way for us to do things? And then if it's not, to improve it and then build it out accordingly into your data model so that it can accommodate your organization's needs. Those are my thoughts, Ruben. Anything to add to that?
No, spot on. So I'll walk through this pretty quickly because I think it helps simplify or again demystify a little bit further how you get from your Excel sheet to this. I won't go through every step, but by way of looking at the examples that we just had, so this here is a data sheet that existed for that manufacturing model that we just started looking at. So effectively, the way this guy works is they plan by shift code and facilities, line bins, products. And they've got these measures: commission per unit, direct labor, direct materials, variable. So this is kind of where they got to. And this could have been, where they came from with their existing system. So excuse the lack of labels at the top here, but they'd have a sheet of something like this. So that comes from an export from a system, a database, or a prior budget. You can see the measures that we were talking about across the top. These are the output measures. So total cost, production units, total cost sales, cost per unit, sorry, and budget sales price. And then over here, you see what exists for the dimensions. So this is shift code, this is product, this is date, this is shift code. But regardless, if you had an Excel sheet like this, you want to get it into the model, the first thing to do is to create each of these dimensions and to have the right elements within them. So the easiest way to do that here in Excel, as you guys are probably all familiar with, is just to come in here, find the dimension, remove the duplicates. And then here you've got all of the elements that are created. This is probably a vendor, I think, or something like that. Here is the product type. Here is the line item, I think. Here is date. So we have a look at date. If we go to remove the duplicates, this is a subset of data, so it's a small set of the data. So we only have 2 months. I think there's only 3 of these guys, 3 of these shifts. So, effectively, however it is, you go about and basically get the list of what it is that you want to create in your dimensions. Once you've got those dimensions, you need to be able to create them in a database. And this is where we use Acteris. So Acteris is actually, you can create a free trial account and get up and running very quickly. Just go to app.acteris.com. There's a link there if you want to have a free trial. It will create a SQL database for you. And it will give you the ability to log into this system, which is the web modeler. And you typically wouldn't use this very much. I just created an account today for Academy 520, but this is where you come to create your dimensions. And once you've created the dimensions and the cubes, you continue to interface with them through Power BI. But this is where you create it. And so I've just come in here and I can go dimensions, create a new dimension, and you can literally just paste the data from Excel. And you can use the first row as column names. I'm going to call it shift. Actually, there's no need for column names here because only one column. And then we have our dimension. And you do the same thing to get the other dimensions. And then once you've got all the dimensions, you go to create a cube and you select the dimensions. So it's really that straightforward. There is this little bit of interfacing that's outside Power BI, but then you can basically connect Power BI straight to this through the SQL database. So once you get your sign-on email, you'll get an address. So I think it's like acterisdb.windows.net, and you put in this string, and you put in your username and password, and Power BI is hooked up to this, and it's your SQL database, and you can edit it through here, and you can plan and whatnot. So there are a bunch of other ways you can, create those databases, but Acteris is a great way of being able to, out of the box, it takes like 3 minutes to create your first database, and then you can copy and paste from Excel and create your cubes. And that's kind of the easiest way to get up and running. There's an Excel tool for it as well, which accountants typically prefer, which you can again use for adding dimensions, and you can bulk upload the data just by getting the data in a format very similar to this, slightly different. You have to unpivot these columns, but you can get an Acteris plugin, just connect and go bulk upload. So, there is obviously initial steps to create the dimension and cube structure, but they're very straightforward. They use a graphical user interface, and then once you're up and running, you're basically back into Power BI with those dimension and cube structures, which you can access through the typical Power BI functionality. So I don't want to spend too much time on that aspect of it. You can sign up for a free demo, you can reach out to the Collectiv team, and they'll help you get up and running on that. And then basically it's kind of pretty self-service. Again, most of the thinking comes around, most of the planning comes with thinking about the planning comes around making sure you've got the right dimension structure and the right elements. Actually creating those dimensions is literally, as you've seen, a copy and a paste, and then clicking on the plus cube and hooking it up together. It's making sure you get that structure right, which is important. So preparing those dimensions in the cube, the uploading, the connecting, configuring is pretty straightforward. If we go back, across the process, to Greg's question, it's the defining your model that is going to be the time-consuming process, and also, the process that is the most rewarded in terms of, further down the line. With that said, if you want to get in and have a play, you can just go and have a look at some sheet you've got, create a throwaway cube with a bunch of dimensions, and experience how it's going to work. But before you actually use that in a production scenario, you want to spend the time getting that definition correct and making sure you're going to cater for all of the input and output requirements throughout the process. That's pretty much what I've got. Is there anything else you want me to go back to or go over, Greg? Or are there any other questions people have?
No, I mean, in my mind, I think that's a great overview of, how we actually do this. I haven't seen any questions come through, but at this point, we'll just open it up for questions regarding everything that Ruben's just kind of gone through. If you're curious about, how this write back works, how we can actually set this up, how could it potentially apply to your scenario, feel free to place in the chat or come off mute and ask us, and we'll do our best to answer your questions. So at this point, I'd just like to open it up for Q&A and go from there. And before I forget, Ruben, thanks for presenting today. Great presentation. So we'll just we'll chill here. If there's any questions, please let us know. If there's no questions, we'll jump after the top of the hour.
Sweet, sounds good. Thanks, Greg.
Audrey, anything to add that would be worth for anybody else left on the call?
We will be sending out an email with the recording and also the slide deck, so everyone can watch out for that. But other than that, I will send the link to the rest of the Collectiv Academy events to check those out. And then I think we should be good.
Sounds great. Well, I tell you what, it doesn't look like there's any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and drop. Ruben, feel free to do the same, and we'll see everybody next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.